I'm sorry.
That's
Oh,
okay.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
So hi, my name is John Chase. I'm the Director of Investigations at the BGA. Should I just talk loud? No, I'll do this. Thank you very much for coming. One thing I wanted, so we're going to open, this is the first time we've done this sort of student reception after our luncheon, and so I really appreciate all of you showing up. We're going to open it up to questions with Scott in a minute, but we did want to talk a little bit just to let you all know about a program that's going to be starting. Thanks in total amount to David Jackson. David, can you raise your hand? He's a former colleague of mine at the Chicago Tribune, and he still works at the Chicago Tribune. He has very graciously and profoundly established an endowment for the next 3 years for an internship program at the BGA. And so, David, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this just for a minute or two. David Jackson.
A reporter establishes an endowment.
I know.
This is history.
It is.
I've never heard of that.
Well, let me explain.
Well, yeah.
Let me explain.
So this is history we're witnessing.
Are you folks the students? Hi, I'm David. I'm a reporter from the Chicago Tribune. I have a colleague. This is named after. He's named Gary Marks, and we were traveling down in Mexico, knocking on the doors of fugitives wanted for murder and interviewing them down in Mexico, and we had a lot of downtime between these very tense encounters in which we were talking in a car, and Gary elicited from me that I basically had never bothered to save much money, and any money I had saved I stuck in a checking account, and that was it. And Gary, to make a long story short, marched me over to Fidelity and had me open a little hobby stock account, and it's done. Been very lucky, and I realized that I don't want to wait until I'm 95 years old and leave a bequest. Probably I'll leave it to somebody I meet in a grocery store at that point in my life, or to the nearest pet store or something. I wanted to do. To give this money away in my lifetime to something I sort of knew about, which is investigative reporting. And the gist of it is that I believe that young people right now very much need to be exposed to and to work with experienced investigative journalists to create a pathway for the next generation to learn the tools of our work and also the sort of the ethics and the morals of how we do what we do. And I checked out every one of the many amazing nonprofit news shops in Chicago, and they're all worthy. But the BGA was really heads and shoulders above anyone else in being able to have the very, very high level of expert investigative reporters, and also to be tackling the highest degree of difficulty in the journalism, which is really public corruption. And so I'm very proud of this, and I'm not going to pick interns. I'm going to just sort of stand back and watch what happens. And the point is that you're the next generation. And
he did a big series at the Chicago Tribune called The Trade, which exposed the sexual abuse that's going on among students, or that was occurring among students and CPS staff. So it's been great. I worked with him on stories, and the fact that he's doing this is wonderful, and so we encourage you all, once the program gets up and going, to apply, and we'll be moving forward on that soon.
That's why the sign-up sheet is going around, so give us your email so we can tell you when it's live, and so, we'll be looking for applicants, so sign in if you haven't yet.
Great, okay.
thank y'all.
Thank you, and then he's off. All right, like the wind, if he can get out. Now I go out the other way. Without further ado, I don't know how many of you were able to attend the luncheon, but if you weren't, speaking of internships, the gentleman to my left, Scott Simon, was a BGA intern back in the day. I will let him...
the golden age.
And he did excellent work with the BGA going through George Dunn's garbage. So I love that first story. That's a great way.
It's a dirty business sometimes.
So anyhow, we wanted to open it up for students to talk to Scott, ask whatever questions you have about the industry, about NPR, about whatever. I just wanted to say one other thing and then I'll hand it off, is what David said is exactly right. You are all the future of journalism in the city, in this country, at a time when it's more necessary and needed and important than ever. And so I really appreciate, this is a great crowd for the first time, us doing this and just sort of trying to do it organically. It's a great turnout, so I really appreciate you all coming here. And without further ado, Mr. Simon.
You're raising your hand for a question?
Yes, my name is Trudy, and I'm from Northeastern Illinois University. I also am kind of a reporter. I'm reporting for the radio station WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM for NEIU. And I just wanted to ask you, what story did you do mattered the most to you? Do you feel made the most impact for our community?
What story did I do that made the most impact for our community? You know, I'll tell you the dirty little secret about journalism sometimes, which is that is impossible to say. What you wind up doing sometimes, you know, some stories you can attach to how it might have affected an individual person's life or something like that. But something that I sometimes tell younger members of our staff is you can't say specifically where this winds up doing any good. And look, I mean, I think we're living in a time now, without getting too specific, when every day we're learning about what I think even here in Chicago we would consider to be criminal behavior in some very high councils, and yet I'm not certain that a lot of people are, or as many people as you would think, are upset by it. And I think sometimes that is, you know, that has also happened in Chicago. I mentioned, you know, when George Dunn had those scandals. This is quite apart from my going through his trash. And sometimes people approach that information as take it or leave it. I think the important thing to do is not necessarily tell yourself that there's impact ahead, so much as that there's impact overall. If you're able to be an honest and conscientious voice, you wind up being a source of trust in the community, and they wind up interested in your work, and every now and then something changes because of it. But it's very inexact. It's not a one-to-one relationship. I mean, I think the story that I reported over the years, that I told myself it's important people be telling this story here and now, was in fact the siege of Sarajevo, where people were being pitilessly slaughtered for 4.5 years, right in front of the eyes of the world. But right in front of the eyes of the world. I don't think the world was roused to action to oppose that slaughter any more than it was in Rwanda, any more than perhaps it is now in Syria and the Kurds. So you can't always tell yourself that that'll happen. But I think it's important for history, and I think it's important for us as a people that our business bear witness, that people be able to find out what happened.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
It's kind of a perfect segue into the question I have. My name is Scott. I'm a journalism student at Columbia College, Chicago. I've been, on a personal level, trying to become more objective and really understand the narrative that goes through my head when I'm covering things or when I'm thinking about life in general. I was wondering if you could speak to the importance that journalism plays in shaping a societal narrative and how that narrative shapes society and changes things.
I've thought about that a lot. You know, and by the way, another dirty little secret I must confide is that I think journalism is contributing less to that nowadays than some other forces are. Because there are lots of sources of information these days which are not what I would consider to be news. and certainly not what I would consider to be journalism, and yet they're shaping thinking. And I think we all know that there are millions of people today who believe things that simply aren't true. I think the best that we can hope for, though, is to assume that people in their heart of hearts, at least in great numbers, know the difference between what they choose to believe and what is actually the case. And it's our job to be honest witnesses to try and provide that for people. But it absolutely has become a more arduous task. Gesundheit. And there's not a day goes by, not an hour, being realistic that people aren't sucked in by something one way or another. Including, by the way, some of us in journalism every now and then. I mean, I certainly have made mistakes, particularly in recent years, that have been fomented by some of the new technologies we're seeing and how easy it is to pass along misinformation. And I'm alarmed by it. But all of that has to redouble our dedication to being absolutely honest and verifiable, and also to be a fair witness. I mean, this is something that I wind up, and you often have to rethink what you do for a living when you're asked to come in and talk to your daughter's school about what you're doing. And I had to speak to the staff of the Georgetown Wicket. This is a name that strikes you as among the greats in journalism. New York Times, Washington Post, Georgetown Wicket. In any event, and by the way, because it's a Catholic school, I very much admire the reporting that they've been doing on the clerical crisis. Reporting, they haven't broken any stories, thank God, because it hasn't happened at their school, or maybe you don't mean to be naive about that, but they have absolutely been reporting honestly the clerical crisis that's in the church and church institutions. In any event, when I go in and found myself having to talk to this about someone, I said, we all have our biases. I mean, I am a Chicagoan. I am from a religious background. I am a Cubs fan. I could go on and on with things. I'm married to a French woman. But I absolutely think when it comes to reporting the news, I am capable of standing aside from all of that and trying to report something honestly. Which is, by the way, I'm alarmed by the current rhetoric we're getting that says that so-and-so can't be an honest witness because they have some kind of affiliation. And I think, oh look, all of us are, a few years ago, I stopped voting. I used to be one of those journalists that felt, of course I can vote, and I don't, it doesn't affect me. Now, I still believe that's true, but I don't vote because I don't want people looking at my voting. And not that, it's secret ballot, but if you live in a place that's thoroughly democratic, obviously, primaries are, and I don't want to register in a primary and have somebody use that to, they think, impeach my reporting. And I regret that, because I think that's not a good example for our daughters, but that's just the times that we're living in. Yes, sir.
This might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but is there a book that has profoundly impacted you, or one that you would really recommend that people in journalism read?
Yeah, more than one, I'm afraid.
Well, I'm open to it.
Yeah, okay. I would read the play, The Front Page, which is set here in Chicago, and is still marvelously funny and highly profane. I was actually the technical advisor for the Broadway revival that was done a couple years ago in New York. Had a great cast, by the way: John Goodman, John Slattery, Nathan Leong. I go on and on. It's as true as it ever was. And look, journalism, it's not going to be confused with the priesthood, and it's, for that matter, not going to be confused with the judiciary. It's a rough and tumble, roused-about profession. And those of us in journalism, we are the descendants of the Front Page, and not Goodnight Moon. Although we've all read Goodnight Moon, or had it read to us, I think probably a little bit more to the case. But you understand why people want to be in the news business when you read that. And what you wind up to, not to give away the end, I'll give away the end, maybe you've seen it, but I still, the play is so enjoyable you should read it anyway. But at the end, despite all the hijinks and despite all the outrageous behavior by the reporters, an innocent person goes free. And that's the kind of thing, despite all of our imperfections, journalism can do every now and then. So I would read that. I would also read Eric Sevareid. The name may not be familiar to a lot of people now, but he became better known as a commentator in his later years on CBS, but he did a great memoir of his days in journalism in North Dakota, and then becoming a reporter during World War II in the Pacific Theater of War and the Mid-Atlantic, or not Mid-Atlantic, Middle East, I'm sorry. And that's called Not So Wild a Dream, and that's a great one. And you know, I think if you want to read the collected columns of Mike Borrego, there have been a couple of collections that are just great. Yes, sir.
My name is Tim Edmonds. I'm a student reporter at Loyola University of Chicago. Talked a little bit about technology, but what advice would you give a young reporter about the direction of where journalism is going?
I often say when I talk to young journalists that the first bit of advice I should give you is get your real estate license, because I think that I don't know where it's going, and if I did, I would be investing whatever I had in it. I don't think anybody knows where it's going. My concern is that information is outpacing journalism, and so many people are confusing the two. Look, I am very active on Twitter, but I think it's important to not confuse what you read on Twitter, or at least what everybody says on Twitter, which in its own way can be irreplaceable. I mean, the students in Hong Kong need Twitter. They even need Facebook. They need WhatsApp to be able to get, not even just their point of view across, but to be able to let us know what's being done to protest in that part of China. But it's not in and of itself journalism. And I do have some concern about journalism surviving, certainly at the scale where it can do the job. You have a couple of, really 3 or 4 news organizations, the Washington Post, obviously the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, that arguably are doing better than ever, but a lot of other places have had to slim staff, throw very good people out into the job market. And there's not necessarily rivalous efforts that are coming up to replace them. All of that being said, if you can figure out a way to do it, it's a very good life. It's a very satisfying way to participate in society. You really have a role. You can really help people. You can really inform yourself. You can really inform others. And that's absolutely what I've loved about it. So I think obviously it's going to become more point of impact. I think the velocity of it is going to concern me a little bit, but that's because people are taking in information that way. And it's going to be necessary for all of us to figure out ways to try and be there to provide it for them in a way that's responsible. And that's going to also take some trial and error too. But as I said inside there, in the grand volume, that makes it all the more worth doing. I wish I could be more hopeful. But, you know, I also think that hundreds of millions of people know how important journalism can be. I think hundreds of millions of people know that, and they see that every day. And we ought to be able to have an industry based on that. I think there's going to be more pay-as-you-go forms of journalism in the future. I noticed the newspaper in Salt Lake City has just reformed itself, even though it's owned by the Huntsman family, which is, they're millionaires, if not billionaires. I think they're billionaires. The Huntsman family has kind of reformed it, if I might use that term, to be a nonprofit. And I think there's going to be more of those efforts. Something like WBEZ, which is a not-for-profit corporation, is I think, with all due regard to friends here from the Tribune and the Sun-Times and other people that might be, you know, is in a position to become in many ways the preeminent news organization here. And of course, that's asking for the contributions of people.
in the spring, I'll be taking a class that gives us a chance to go to the Iowa caucuses as well as South
that's
Carolina
wonderful.
for the primaries.
In the spring?
Yes,
Iowa caucuses are in February.
yeah, we're going,
Okay, good, yeah.
yeah, we're going in.
Somebody
beginning
sold you a bill of goods, yeah.
Beginning of February and then the end and into the beginning of March.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask for some of your advice on how to kind of just get people to like be comfortable talking about their political views, especially in light of kind of the distrust of media that kind of we're dealing with.
I think you'll find that there is, you're going to be talking to a special breed of people when you go to Iowa. Everyone in Iowa has been interviewed. Everybody in Iowa gets up expecting that they will be interviewed before the caucus season is over. I don't want to say there's not distrust of media, but I think you'll find people very open. I think you'll also find Iowans very well informed. And it's not just because they know that the eyes of the country, if not the world, are upon them. Particularly here in Chicago, we can misunderstand what an international business agriculture has become. People who are involved in agriculture, actually growing things or selling them, promoting them, the entire agribusiness structure that takes up so much of the, I think, economic investment of the state, that is highly dependent upon technology and satellites and market predictions in a way that I think would, I know speaking as a city kid, did astonish me when I learned about it. They are much more, I think, up to date on international trade than most of us in the city are, because it affects their lives in a very personal and direct way. So I think you'll have a great time, and I don't think you'll run into much resistance. I've always found there's a difference between the journalism people are certain they hate and the reporter that's right in front of them. And just be respectful and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, could I please take a few minutes of your time? I'm not saying that some people won't give you the brush off, but I think for the most part you'll find a lot of people who say, well, okay, or I don't really like the press, but you seem nice. And that counts for a lot. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned in your speech inside and here briefly, and you've shared a lot of tips today. So investigations are crucially important, and you briefly mentioned newsrooms are shrinking. Can you talk about or give us some sort of helpful tips or words of encouragement for us going into a field that we know it's going to be extremely hard to get into? Jobs are going to be really scarce, especially for the journalists of color here. So any tips or any words of encouragement for us heading into that career field?
Tips I don't have. The words of encouragement I do. It's important. You've been called to important work. Don't discount that. Don't forget that. This is work that cries out to be done for the good of us in this country, and that's why it's important to do it. So try not to be easily deterred. Look, everybody has to wind up making personal decisions. I think a lot of things wind up, as I keep, again, telling young staff members, let life change you. There's something wrong if you have the same convictions when you're 30 that you did when you were 20, and something really wrong if at the age of 40 you're still thinking that way. Let life change you. Be open to experience. But I think the kind of work that you're doing right now, increasingly organizations, there's no organization quite like the BGA. But I think increasingly important investigative work that includes the BGA, and there might be other lesser organizations, watchdog organizations that are at it, are going to be conducted by those organizations working in concert with news groups of one kind or another, because I think increasingly the person power in journalistic groups just might not be there. There are people in NPR's investigative unit, and I obviously have to be careful about sharing too much information, but there are people who have spent 2 years on a story only to find it doesn't wash out. And that's the business sometimes. That's also reporting. I mean, our audience may not know about it, but that's also reporting. And you also find, though, that in those 2 years of investigation, even if something doesn't pan out the way you thought, you learn stuff along the way that might wind up panning out. So all of the work you're doing, all of what you're finding out, can be important ultimately, and it's vital for you folks to remember that. I also, look, I've had a very blessed life in this business. There will be roadblocks along the way. But I think if you really want to do it, you won't be deterred. You'll find a way to do it. You find a way to go around the roadblock. And insofar as that, we lose good people because of that, but we also find that some good people are made even stronger as they figure out a way to circumvent the frustration. And I'm afraid I believe in that. I think in a relatively open society like ours, I think that has a bracing effect that I like to think makes us tougher. And look, I think I was telling David a few weeks ago when we were talking on the phone, there is no better background for being a reporter in the world than having been a reporter in Chicago. You see everything in this city. You meet people from all over the world. This city is known all over the world. I was just thinking when we were talking about Afghanistan, when I was covering the war in Afghanistan, and we were renting a house as the Taliban was retreating. And you should recognize this was a time that Danny Pearl, who was the Wall Street Journal reporter, had been kidnapped. So the British Army had come up to us and said, look, we don't want to alarm you, but we think the Taliban is using kidnapping of reporters as a tactic, and you are particularly vulnerable if you're a reporter, and particularly if you're an American or British reporter. And they said not to put too fine a point on it. Also, if you're Jewish, half of my family is Jewish, and my producer and I said, well, I guess we've got the whole waterfront covered now at this particular point. And so we were renting a house in a neighborhood of Kabul, and there was no electricity. And everybody blamed the war, and we finally figured out one day, but there hadn't been any explosions, so why was the electricity off? We were ultimately introduced to a Taliban commander who explained, well, we haven't been paid in 2 months. That's why the electricity is off. And the producer, a wonderful man whom I work with, said, well, that's just not fair. That's just not honest. You've got to turn the electricity back on. And I said, forgive my colleague, I'm from Chicago. How much would it take to get the electricity back on? And he mentioned a figure, and within 24 hours the electricity was back on. So I'm always grateful to my Chicago background. When I was a reporter in India, a man who I liked a lot, who was the communist boss of Bengal, Jody Bose, we used to complain about Indira Gandhi, who had come out of prison and was a political figure again. He used to say, Indira Gandhi, she's such a dictator, she's a tyrant, she's a regular Mayor Daley. And I remember thinking, my God, you've got 1 billion people here, and you have to come to my hometown to have some sort of simile for tyranny. And it just, years before I covered the siege of Sarajevo, I covered a bombing of a storefront on the northwest side of a Bosnian headquarters of a Bosnian nationalist group, thinking, my God, what a dated, antiquated quarrel this is. How could people still be killing each other over this? Only to discover a few years later I was going to cover that battle in real time, but I had first learned about it in Chicago. There is no better preparation for being a reporter around the world than this city. And if I might put it this way, the history of corruption is only going to redound to your benefit. Because you're going to learn and see things and be familiar with, let me put it nicely, be familiar with human frailty. And I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Thank you.
Could you give us some insight into why it is that after some very good investigative reporting, such as from the BGA and even from the former Inspector General Faisal Khan of Chicago, that with all the evidence that journalists have uncovered, that the law enforcement have not been able to bring forth any indictment or prosecution?
I don't know the answer to that, and I think the answer to that, depends on each and every individual case, and for that matter, having the political will to do something about it. Some answers are depressingly pedestrian. And I remember when there was the prosecutor in Baltimore County brought a slew of indictments against police officers there following the death of Freddie Gray. And you might remember what happened. They got before juries, and the juries voted to acquit. It's real life. That's what happens. You do better on the next story and hope ultimately that something makes a difference. But no, I cannot answer that. I have no good or even facile answer for it. It's just the world that we live in sometimes. But that makes it all the more worth digging in. Look, I have a dream is perhaps not. I want to do our show 1 week from the south side of Chicago, and this is something that I talk about here with WBEZ. We could do it in the Grand Ballroom. We could do it in the studios here, Navy Pier or something. I want to do it on the south side, because unfortunately in our times, a lot of people have used that moniker to represent something that I think doesn't do justice to the human community that it is. Which is not to say that, there aren't too many homicides in Chicago. I think we all know that that's the case. But I happened to look it up, the other day when the president talked again. Look, Chicago is actually only the 24th highest in homicides. Now, only. Obviously, that's too high. It's nothing to be proud of. And it's also nothing to be defensive about. I think this is the human community, and those are our brothers and sisters who are being killed. I think the 7-year-old girl looks like she's going to be all right. But all that being said, I don't think journalism does the public any good when we fall into these easy identifications and categories. So I want to do our show from the south side, and insofar as we can, present the entire range of humanity, so that people just don't look at one thing. And I'd like to do that. WBEZ says it's fine with them, so we have to figure out the best way to do it. And I also know that it's an election year, and talking to people about current events in the news, it's obviously it's going to be a little one-sided, right? I believe the city is thoroughly Democratic, is it? Sorry. But in any event, we'll figure out a way to do this.
Thank you very much for that.
Have I bored everyone? All right, thank you. You're not asking a question, you're scratching your head. Look, if there's anything I can do to be helpful, please let me know.
Could you give us a description about your first break in getting a prominent news job position?
My first break. There's no good story to it. I was just hired. I was part of a group of people that were putting out an underground newspaper. And have you heard the term newspaper? It's kind of like they print out what's online. It's absolutely amazing. And they have auditions for a news show, and I got the job.
Congratulations.
Simple as that. But in any event, there are a lot of people that I have to be permanently grateful to along the way, including Hal Bergen here at the Better Government Association. There was a man named John Calloway, who was news director of Channel 11, a fixture in the city for many years, who was wonderful with me. And I wound up giving the eulogy at his funeral. He was a great guy. There was a guy named Charles Bailey III, who was our first Washington editor at NPR. You might see one of his books called 7 Days in May, which was made into a film. And so excited because the film is a great film by John Frankenheimer, and starred Ava Gardner and Kirk Douglas, who is still with us. I think, I'm trying, Burt Lancaster too, great cast. In any event, he was so excited to meet Ava Gardner, and he was, director introduced him. Ava, this is Chuck Bailey, he wrote the book, and Ava Gardner took his hand and said, "Oh dear, it's so good to meet you, but I never read the book." And Chuck said, "Well, that's what happens in journalism, you know. That nobody cares how you get to it." So I have a lot of people to be grateful for who gave me a chance. I must say, I'm certain even when I didn't deserve it, and God willing, there'll be people like that in your lives ahead too, who will see something and decide that you're worth taking a chance on.
May I ask one more question? Along the way, you must have had many mentors. What is the most profound advice, piece of advice from a mentor that you could share with us?
Boy, that's a good question, and I wish I had something that one thing that came to mind immediately. I'm just I'm just a little flummoxed for the moment. Interestingly, what I just said a few minutes ago was something that John Calloway first said to me, which is, he said, you know, if you have a rich career in this business, you're going to have different ideas when you're 35 than when you're 25. And I think he's absolutely right. Particularly, you know, we get to see the world in a way that I think few people do. And that's a privilege and it's a blessing, and we ought to learn from it. But we shouldn't just absorb all this stuff and not let us, you know, not let us change us. I thought about that. Were people here when I was being a pompous ass with David in there? Somewhere. Not everybody. You will recognize the name Bill Daley. Son of a mayor, brother of a mayor, ran for mayor himself this last time. And I was doing a piece, I do stories for CBS Sunday morning on the anniversary of the 68 Democratic Convention. And we replayed for him the famous video you will see of his father, Richard J. Daley, shouting, screaming at Senator from Connecticut, Abe Brittencourt, who was on the podium. Language I cannot use here, but in any event, it's obvious when you see it, and I'll just say the F word is involved. And of course I asked Bill Daley about this, and he said, oh no, what my father was saying, he was saying faker, you faker. and you know, I laughed and I thought this was pretty ridiculous, and I was talking to my wife about it, explaining this to her. My wife was French, and she said, "Daddy, don't you think someday our daughters will cover up for you for something silly that you said, but they'll do it because they love you and they know what's in your heart?" And I just felt a pang inside because, of course, my wife was absolutely right. And I had only seen Bill Daley as a political figure and had forgotten. There are few things that are more poignant or precious to us than the relationship between father and son. And you know, I wish I'd thought about that at the time. I would have said, "Oh, come on," or, you know, or "Look, I respect your love for your father," but what, you know, but in any event, it took someone outside of the business to recognize that. And one of the things that I do worry about, and I've heard this from a number of the people who were important in my life, not to become jaded. I mean, I can remember covering wars. And people would get jaded. Veteran war correspondents would say, "Oh, you think this is bad here in Sarajevo? Well, you should have seen what it was like in Somalia." Or, "You think it's bad here in Somalia? You should have seen what it was like in Rwanda." Or, "El Salvador, oh, this place is nothing. You should have seen what it was like in Nicaragua." And people get jaded because they see so much. It's important not to get jaded, to judge each and every situation anew, and to bring fresh eyes and a fresh heart and fresh spirit to it. And I think that's, if you're going to do this for a living, I think that's something that's very, very important. Because if you are jaded and cynical, you lose your sense of perspective. And I think that's very important. Also, if I might say, have real lives. I mean, I think my I hope my work, my perspective is better because, you know, we have a family and daughters and spend time and know what it's all about. Don't forget to do that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you very much. Really appreciate all the time you spent with this group.
Think anyone will stop me on the street?
We're heading south for a drink, so they might stop you, you know, once we
Oh
get
my
south.
God, that's right.
So thanks everybody for coming. As I think probably was mentioned earlier, we, did you, John?
Yeah,
Talk about the
yep,
internship
everybody,
program? Okay, I'll let
please
you
sign
close
up
it.
on that sheet if you haven't already. And once we get rolling on the program, we will absolutely let you know. So, yeah, David Jackson spoke before.
Excellent.
So, yeah,
Excellent.
it's great. So, but if you have any questions about it, David obviously disappeared. I'm here